The Zarathi throne world was the kind of place that made you question whether architecture could be actively hostile. Corporal Daniel Mitchell stood in the palace's entry hall, staring at walls that seemed to judge him, and finding them disappointed in his existence. The crystalline structures sang a harmony that probably meant something profound in Zarathi culture, but to human ears sounded like a violin being tortured for information it didn't have. The floor beneath his feet wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite liquid, but existed in a state that the briefing materials had called selectively corporeal, which Daniel translated as, will definitely make you fall at the worst possible moment. "Stop looking so nervous," Lieutenant Rodriguez whispered beside him, though her own face suggested she was one unexpected sound away from bolting for the shuttle. "You're just here to fix things when they break." "Everything here looks like it would break me if I touched it wrong," Daniel replied, adjusting his dress uniform for the 15th time. The technical specialist designation on his collar felt like a joke. He'd been added to the diplomatic mission because he could repair translation matrices and had a minor in xenopsychology, which apparently qualified him to stand in rooms where one wrong word could start an interstellar incident. The truth was, he'd been chosen because he was expendable enough to risk, but competent enough to possibly be useful, a combination that the military cherished. Ambassador Harrison was already deep in preliminary discussions with the Zarathi Council, his voice carrying that forced diplomatic cheer that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, possibly including active combat zones. The treaty negotiations were critical. The Zarathi Empire controlled the quantum gates that could cut Earth's travel time to the outer colonies by decades. Without their cooperation, humanity would remain a scattered collection of isolated worlds, connected by journeys that took longer than most political careers. The council chamber doors opened with a sound like reality clearing its throat, and then she entered, and the universe forgot how to breathe. Queen Zyxara didn't walk so much as flow into existence, her movement suggesting that physics had agreed to make special exceptions for her. 7 feet of controlled power wrapped in armor that looked like captured starlight given form. She had 6 eyes that could track multiple threats, conversations, or architectural failures simultaneously. Her silver-blue skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an effect that made her appear to be carved from the space between stars. 4 arms moved with independent grace, each one capable of gestures that conveyed meanings the human brain couldn't quite process. Daniel's brain, which had been maintaining professional composure, immediately betrayed him with observations his xenopsychology training hadn't prepared him for. The Queen's armor, despite clearly being designed for intimidation and protection, couldn't entirely hide the fact that she had curves that would make geometry textbooks rewrite their chapters on perfect proportions. Her movement had a hypnotic quality that made watching her feel like witnessing a fundamental force of nature decide to be graceful. "The humans have arrived," she said, and her voice was what absolute zero would sound like if it had opinions and all of them were disappointed. "Begin." The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of failed negotiations, cultural misunderstandings, and Daniel desperately trying to fix translation matrices that seemed determined to convert every third word into what sounded like existential dread. The Zarathi spoke in harmonics that human ears could barely detect, while their written language existed in dimensions that gave translators the digital equivalent of migraines. He'd spent hours crammed into access panels, trying to recalibrate systems that had been designed by beings who thought user-friendly meant, won't actively try to kill you. Each evening, he'd return to his quarters, a room that couldn't decide if it was meant for sleeping or meditation or possibly low-level torture, and write in his journal. It was a habit from his psychology training, a way to process experiences that the human brain wasn't quite equipped to handle. The entries were never meant for anyone else's eyes, encrypted and password-protected with the kind of paranoia that came from growing up with 3 older sisters who thought privacy was a challenge. The entry that would doom him had been written after a particularly long day, and what he'd later calculate was exactly 3 shots too many of Chief Burke's emergency morale enhancer, a liquid that existed in a legal gray area and tasted like regret with hints of battery acid. The Queen had spent 6 hours discussing trade routes in a language that sounded like crystalline wind chimes having an argument, and Daniel's brain had given up on professionalism entirely. His fingers had moved across the tablet with the kind of honesty that only came from exhaustion and questionable alcohol. Day 3. The Queen is terrifying but oddly beautiful. Like if a statue of a war goddess came to life and decided to rule through pure intimidation. She's got these curves that her armor can't quite hide, and I'm definitely going to hell for noticing, but her butt is absolutely perfect. Like architecturally perfect. The kind of perfection that makes you question if gravity works differently for royalty. I spent an hour today pretending to calibrate the translation matrix just so I could observe how she moves. It's hypnotic in a way that probably violates several treaties. Her secondary left eye does this thing when she's concentrating that's weirdly adorable, like she's solving equations that haven't been invented yet. Note to self: do not think about this during tomorrow's technical presentation. Additional note: stop writing these notes. Third note: I'm definitely too drunk to be writing this. Fourth note: architecturally perfect. Fifth note: if anyone ever reads this, I'm moving to a colony where shame hasn't been invented yet. He'd written it, laughed at his own inappropriateness, saved it to his private encrypted folder with a password that was just keyboard smashing, and promptly passed out. The tablet had been in his utility pocket during the next day's inspection of the throne room's environmental systems. The Zarathi Palace, in its infinite wisdom, had environmental controls that required manual calibration from access panels, hidden in the most inconvenient places possible. Daniel had spent 4 hours wedged under various consoles, trying to figure out why the atmospheric processors were making everything smell vaguely of disappointment and ozone. At one point, he'd been completely upside down, his legs sticking out from under a console while 3 Zarathi guards watched with what he hoped was professional interest rather than amusement. It must have fallen out when he'd been contorted into a position that his spine would be filing formal complaints about for weeks. The palace's biofloors, which were supposed to be self-cleaning, had apparently decided that the tablet looked like it belonged there, and had partially absorbed it into what appeared to be an art installation about the futility of human technology. The floors, Daniel would later learn, had a rudimentary consciousness and a sense of humor that could only be described as cruel. He didn't notice its absence until the next morning, when his morning alarm didn't go off, because the device responsible for it was currently being held by the Queen of 17 star systems. He'd searched his quarters frantically, torn apart his tool kit, even checked the engineering department's lost and found, which contained items that seemed to exist in theoretical states of lostness. It wasn't until he entered the throne room for the final day of negotiations that he discovered where his tablet had gone, and by then, it was far too late. The delegation had assembled in formal rows, everyone wearing their best "please don't declare war on us" expressions. The treaty was almost complete, success within reach. Daniel had just finished a minor adjustment to the translation matrix when Queen Zyxara raised one hand, and his entire world shifted from routine diplomatic mission to career-ending catastrophe in the span of a heartbeat. She was holding his tablet, and her expression suggested she'd read every single word he'd written about her architecturally perfect posterior. The throne room's silence was so complete that Daniel could hear his own cells dying of mortification. 300 Zarathi nobles stood frozen like statues carved from judgment, their 1,200 eyes collectively focused on the small human tablet in their queen's hands. The device looked almost toy-like in her grip, but it might as well have been a weapon of mass destruction for the damage it was about to do to Daniel's career, dignity, and quite possibly his continued existence. Before we continue with our negotiations, Queen Zyxara said, her voice maintaining the kind of calm that suggested she was savoring every moment of this, I believe one of your delegation has lost something rather personal. Ambassador Harrison's face went through several expressions, finally settling on one that suggested he was calculating whether throwing Daniel out an airlock would be considered a diplomatic incident or a mercy killing. Rodriguez, standing next to Daniel, took a subtle step away as if embarrassment might be contagious. Chief Burke was already reaching for his hip flask, apparently deciding that if they were about to witness an execution, he might as well be properly fortified. Corporal Mitchell, the Queen continued, all 6 eyes focusing on him with the intensity of a star-going supernova while someone took detailed notes. I believe this is yours. Daniel's throat made a sound that xenolinguists would later classify as pre-verbal panic, with undertones of professional death and subtle notes of existential regret. His brain offered several responses, ranging from "that's not mine" to "I've never seen that device before in my life" to "can I please just die right now?" What came out was a strangled, "Your Majesty." The biofloors brought it to my attention this morning, she explained, turning the tablet so everyone could see it clearly. They classified it as literary content of unusual honesty. Naturally, I was curious. Your security encryption was impressive, but my palace has been breaking code since before your species discovered fire. To be fair, Daniel heard himself say, because apparently his mouth had decided that if he was going down, he might as well go down memorably. We discovered fire quite early in our evolution. One of the Queen's eyes twitched in what might have been amusement. The other 5 maintained their focus with terrifying intensity. Yes, well, your journal entries are equally evolutionary. Shall I share with the court your observations on Zarathi architecture? The way she said architecture made it abundantly clear she wasn't referring to buildings. Several nobles made sounds that their species probably used to express shock, but to human ears sounded like Crystal having a panic attack. Ambassador Harrison looked like he was aging in real time, his hair actually turning grayer as they watched. Your Majesty, Harrison started, his diplomatic training desperately grasping for words that might prevent the catastrophe about to unfold. I'm certain that whatever private musings my subordinate may have recorded were never intended. Oh, they were quite private, Zyxara agreed, her tone suggesting that privacy was about to become extremely public. And remarkably specific, Day 3 Corporal Mitchell wrote the following. She cleared her throat, which was unnecessary since Zarathi didn't need to clear their throats, meaning she was doing it purely for dramatic effect. Daniel realized with crystal clarity that the Queen of 17 star systems was about to roast him in front of 300 nobles and his entire delegation, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. The Queen is terrifying but oddly beautiful, she began, her voice making each word sound like it was being carved into the fundamental laws of the universe. Like if a statue of a war goddess came to life and decided to rule through pure intimidation. The temperature in the room dropped by at least 10 degrees. Somewhere in the back, a younger noble made a sound like they were choking on their own shock. Daniel wondered if it was possible for embarrassment to actually kill someone, and if so, whether it would at least be quick. She's got these curves that her armor can't quite hide, the Queen continued, and now there was definitely something in her voice that wasn't quite the anger everyone expected. And I'm definitely going to hell for noticing, but her butt is absolutely perfect. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. A translation matrix in the corner started playing what sounded like funeral music, apparently deciding to provide a soundtrack for Daniel's professional death. Even the palace's biowalls seemed to lean in, not wanting to miss what happened next. Like, architecturally perfect, The kind of perfection that makes you question if gravity works differently for royalty. Chancellor Vex, who hadn't shown emotion in 4 centuries, made a sound like a computer trying to process a paradox. 3 elderly advisors clutched their ceremonial pearls, which were actually contained singularities that pulsed with offended energy. The guards' plasma weapons hummed with what Daniel desperately hoped wasn't anticipation for his immediate vaporization. "I spent an hour today," the Queen continued, clearly enjoying herself now, pretending to calibrate the translation matrix just so I could observe how she moves. It's hypnotic in a way that probably violates several treaties. Rodriguez had her hand over her mouth, and Daniel couldn't tell if she was stifling laughter or preparing to scream. Chief Burke had given up all pretense and was now openly drinking from his flask while watching the disaster unfold with the fascination of someone watching a ship sink in slow motion. Her secondary left eye does this thing when she's concentrating that's weirdly adorable, like she's solving equations that haven't been invented yet. Then something happened that the Zarathi historical records would later describe as the impossible moment, and scholars would debate for centuries. The Queen's mouth twitched, not in anger, not in disgust, but in what looked suspiciously like suppressed amusement. The corners of her lips moved upward in a motion that her facial muscles seemed surprised to discover they could perform. "Architecturally perfect," she repeated, and a sound started deep in her throat, something her vocal cords had never produced in 3 centuries of existence. Queen Zyxara of the Zarathi Empire, terror of the 17 systems, holder of the quantum crown, speaker of the stellar parliament, laughed. It started as a giggle, which was shocking enough from a being who'd never shown emotion beyond cold calculation. Then it evolved into actual laughter, the kind that came from genuine amusement rather than political maneuvering. Finally, it became full-bodied, unconscious mirth that had her gripping her throne for support while her 4 arms shook with the force of it. The court's reaction was pure, undiluted chaos wearing formal robes and trying desperately to maintain dignity. Guards dropped weapons that hadn't left their hands since they were forged. One actually dropped his plasma rifle on his foot and didn't even notice, too shocked by the sound of their queen experiencing joy. Chancellor Vex's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, making him look like a fish that had just discovered air existed, but wasn't sure what to do with the information. 3 elderly advisors fainted in perfect synchronization, as if they'd rehearsed it. A younger noble in the back started laughing too, caught up in the impossible moment, then immediately looked terrified at what he'd done. "Architecturally perfect," the Queen gasped between laughs, tears streaming from at least 3 of her 6 eyes. "Oh, by the void that spawned us all, he said my posterior is architecturally perfect." Daniel stood frozen, his brain experiencing the kind of complete system failure usually reserved for computers trying to divide by 0. Part of him wanted to run, part wanted to die, and part was oddly proud that he'd made an emotionless alien queen laugh for the first time in 3 centuries. What came out of his mouth was, "I stand by my assessment." This made her laugh even harder. The aftermath of what the Zarathi historians would call the day the Queen learned joy, and humans would forever know as the incident that shall not be named at diplomatic functions, transformed the palace in ways that made physics uncomfortable and protocol weep. Queen Zyxara, having discovered laughter, seemed determined to make up for 3 centuries of missed opportunities. She appointed Daniel as her official cultural attachment, a title that everyone understood meant person who makes the Queen act like a person, but sounded official enough to prevent immediate execution for his architectural observations. "You will attend all meetings," she announced the next morning, finding Daniel trying to hide behind a potted plant that existed in 6 dimensions simultaneously. The plant, sensing his distress, kept trying to phase him into a dimension where his embarrassment didn't exist, but unfortunately his shame appeared to be multiversal. "I require your architectural expertise." "Your Majesty," Daniel started, his voice cracking like he was going through puberty again. "I'm really just a technical specialist." "Who writes poetry about posteriors," she interrupted, all 6 eyes displaying what he was beginning to recognize as amusement. The expression was still new on her face, like she was trying on emotions for the first time and finding them surprisingly comfortable. "Tell me, Corporal Mitchell, do you have similar observations about the rest of my council?" Daniel looked at the assembled Zarathi nobles, most of whom still looked traumatized from witnessing their queen laugh. Some of them had the hollow-eyed expression of beings whose entire worldview had been shattered and were still trying to process the debris. "I try to keep my architectural assessments limited to one per species, Your Majesty." "How disappointing," she said, and then smiled. The expression was unpracticed, slightly too wide, showing more teeth than was probably intended, but genuine. "We'll work on expanding your portfolio. Chancellor Vex, for instance, has what you humans might call impressive structural integrity, despite his advanced age." Vex made a sound like a harmonic screaming internally, while maintaining external composure. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular." "Everything interesting usually is," she replied, then turned back to Daniel. "I've been reviewing your journal further. You have quite extensive notes on human humor. Teach me to be funny." "I don't think that's how it works." "Nonsense. You made me laugh with your inappropriate honesty. Surely you can teach me to make others laugh with inappropriate honesty." The morning briefings became something between comedy workshops and therapy sessions for an entire species learning to feel. Zyxara would enter the council chambers, review the reports of the Empire's various victories and conquests with her usual efficiency, then turn to Daniel and ask questions that made the council want to dissolve into their component atoms and drift away. "Explain human humor to me," she demanded during a particularly serious discussion about tax codes in the outer systems. "Your species finds suffering amusing." "Not exactly," Daniel tried to explain, while Chancellor Vex looked like he was calculating the fastest way to retire to a dimension where emotions hadn't been invented. "We laugh at the unexpected, the absurd, the architecturally imperfect." "But you found my architecture perfect," she pointed out, making several nobles choke on air they didn't technically need to breathe. "Yet you still laughed when I read your assessment." "That was nervous laughter. Different category entirely. Like when you're about to die and your brain decides to find it hilarious instead of terrifying." "Fascinating. So humor is how humans cope with impending doom." She considered this. "That explains your entire species' foreign policy." Even Daniel had to laugh at that. "Did you just make a joke about humanity?" "Was it funny?" "Actually, yes." Her eyes lit up with delight. "I made a joke, Council, make note. The Queen has achieved humor regarding human self-destructive tendencies." She began experimenting with different types of humor, though her understanding was still developing. During a trade negotiation with the Proxima colonies, she suddenly asked, "Why did the human cross the void?" The Proxima ambassador, a being that looked like what would happen if a jellyfish mated with a calculator, paused mid-sentence. "I beg your pardon. It's a joke structure Daniel taught me. Why did the human cross the void?" Everyone turned to look at Daniel, who sighed and played along. "Why, Your Majesty?" "To compliment my architecture." She delivered it with the timing of someone who'd practiced in front of a mirror for hours, then laughed at her own joke with such genuine delight that even the Proxima ambassador's tentacle calculators twitched in what might have been amusement. "That's terrible," Daniel told her. "I know, isn't it wonderful? I've been working on variations." "Why did the Zarathi Council faint?" "Because they discovered their queen has a sense of humor and an architecturally perfect posterior." Chancellor Vex made a sound that suggested his resignation was being composed in real time, across 17 dimensions. In private, she was different. The public joy was real, but underneath was something deeper, more vulnerable. She'd summoned Daniel to her private chambers, rooms that existed in so many dimensions that looking at them too long caused headaches and occasionally mild temporal displacement. The furniture seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, being both comfortable and uncomfortable until you sat on it and collapsed the waveform. "Your journal," she said one evening as they stood on the observation deck, watching three suns set simultaneously in different spectrums of light. The view was spectacular in ways that human eyes could barely process, colors that didn't have names shifting through spectrums that shouldn't exist. "You write what you truly think." "Always," Daniel admitted. "It helps me process things, especially things that don't make sense, like alien queens who rule through terror but have architectural perfection that defies physics." "You really can't help yourself, can you?" But she was smiling as she said it. "No one has ever just observed me before. They see the crown, the power, the threat. You saw a person with, how did you phrase it in entry 7, curves that armor can't hide and a presence that makes gravity reconsider its life choices. You read all my entries. Multiple times. Your description of Ambassador Harrison trying to eat four-dimensional soup was particularly amusing. Also, your theory about why Chief Burke's moonshine might technically qualify as a weapon of mass destruction shows surprising scientific insight. Daniel felt his face burning. Those were private thoughts. And now they're my favorite reading material. Do you know what my advisors call me when they think I'm not listening? I couldn't guess. The eternal function. Like I'm just a program running the Empire's operating system. She turned to face him, all 6 eyes showing vulnerability that 3 centuries of emotional suppression had hidden. Then you come along and write that my butt defies gravity, and suddenly I discover I'm a person. A person who can laugh, who can feel joy, who can be inappropriate. You were always a person, Daniel said softly. You just needed permission to act like one. Permission from a human who can't keep his thoughts to himself. The best kind of permission, accidental and irreversible. She laughed, that sound that was becoming more natural every day. Teach me more about being inappropriate. I want to understand this dad joke phenomenon you mentioned in entry 12. Oh no, that's a dangerous path. Perfect, all the best paths are dangerous. Tell me the worst joke you know. Daniel sighed. Why don't scientists trust atoms? I don't know why. Because they make up everything. She stared at him for a full 10 seconds, all 6 eyes displaying different stages of processing. Then she burst into laughter so intense she actually had to sit down on a chair that might or might not have existed before she needed it. That's terrible, she gasped. It's a pun about fundamental physics and lying. It's the worst thing I've ever heard. I love it. The crisis came 3 months after the Queen discovered joy, during the Festival of Silent Victories, an annual celebration where the Empire's conquests were reviewed in absolute silence as a form of respect for the defeated. This year, however, when the Procton annexation was mentioned, Queen Zyxara had snorted with laughter loud enough to shatter 3 ceremonial crystals and cause a minor diplomatic incident with a species that communicated through carefully maintained silence. They surrendered via interpretive dance, she explained to the horrified council, still giggling. How is that not hilarious? They spent 6 hours dancing their capitulation. Their general did a particularly moving piece about accepting defeat through the medium of ballet. There were costumes. Chancellor Vex stood, his ancient form trembling with indignation that had been building since the day she first laughed. His 600 years of service had not prepared him for a queen who made puns during sacred ceremonies, and had instituted something called Casual Fridays, where formality was apparently optional. Your Majesty, this human influence has compromised you. You laugh at sacred ceremonies, you make jokes during military briefings, you were seen. Teaching the human something called the Macarena at the diplomatic reception. He was teaching me, actually, Zyxara corrected. I'm still struggling with the hip movement. Apparently having 4 arms makes it more complicated than intended. You see, Vex gestured wildly at Daniel, who was trying to become invisible despite standing in plain sight. This human has corrupted you with his architectural observations and his infectious emotions. You're no longer the queen who conquered the helix nebula through psychological warfare. Actually, I conquered it through superior firepower, she corrected. The psychological warfare was just for fun. Rather like Daniel's journal entries, honest, inappropriate, and surprisingly effective. You've abandoned 3 centuries of tradition for the approval of a human who writes about your posterior in his diary. The journal, both Daniel and Zyxara corrected simultaneously, then looked at each other and burst into laughter. This, Vex roared, his composure finally cracking like ice under a blowtorch. This is exactly the problem. You share inside jokes. You laugh at the same things. You've been seen holding hands with him. You have 4 hands and you waste one on affection. I call for the council of judgment. The room went silent except for the sound of one of the ceremonial crystals still tinkling as it continued to shatter in slow motion. The council of judgment was an ancient law that hadn't been invoked in a millennium. The last time it had been used, the resulting legal battle had lasted 300 years and ended with everyone involved being so confused about the original complaint that they'd given up and gone home. The council of judgment. Zyxara said slowly, "You're challenging my fitness to rule because I learned to laugh. I'm challenging your fitness because you've become emotional, compromised. You spent an entire military meeting yesterday explaining why a chicken crossing a road is somehow humorous. It's about subverting expectations," Daniel offered helpfully, then shut up when everyone turned to stare at him. "You see," Vex pointed at Daniel like he was Exhibit A in the universe's most bizarre trial. "He speaks without permission. He makes you laugh during sacred ceremonies. He has opinions about your architecture." "Very positive opinions," Daniel couldn't help adding. "Inappropriate opinions," Vex corrected. "Architecturally accurate opinions," Zyxara said with dignity. The trial was set for 3 days hence, to be broadcast across all 17 systems. Daniel tried to convince Zyxara to ban him from attending, to distance herself from his influence, to blame the whole thing on translation errors or diplomatic misunderstandings. "Absolutely not," she said, pulling him close with all 4 arms in a gesture that had become familiar over the past months. "You started this revolution with your inability to keep your thoughts to yourself. You'll see it through." "I just wrote about your butt," Daniel protested. "This seems like an escalation. The best revolutions start with someone saying something they shouldn't. Besides, I've been working on my closing argument. It includes 7 puns, 4 dad jokes, and a limerick about Vex's structural integrity. They'll definitely remove you from power. Then I'll have more time to work on my stand-up routine. I've been writing material about the absurdity of conquest. Did you know we spent 3 years fighting over a planet that turned out to be a very convincing hologram?" The day of the trial arrived with all the pomp and circumstance of a civilization that had been emotionally constipated for 3 centuries, finally discovering laxatives. The Chamber of Judgment was packed with representatives from every world in the Empire, including some who'd traveled from systems so far away they'd technically arrived before they'd left. Vex presented his case with the methodical precision of someone who'd been preparing this argument since the day the Queen first smiled. He showed recordings of her laughing at inappropriate times, making jokes during sacred ceremonies, dancing. The Macarena looked particularly damning when played in slow motion. And most seriously, showing affection for a human who had described her royal form in terms of structural engineering. "She has even," Vex said with the kind of disgust usually reserved for war crimes, "instituted something called Taco Tuesday, where the royal kitchens are required to serve human food that doesn't even exist in the same dimensional plane as proper nutrition." When it was Zyxara's turn to respond, she stood slowly, all 6 eyes surveying the crowd. Daniel noticed she was nervous. Her secondary left eye was doing that thing he'd found adorable, solving equations that didn't exist yet. "My response," she began, then paused. "My response is that Chancellor Vex is absolutely right." The crowd exploded in shocked whispers. Vex looked triumphant. Daniel wondered if he was about to watch the woman he'd fallen in love with be deposed, because he couldn't keep his thoughts about her posterior to himself. "I have changed," Zyxara continued. "I laugh now. I joke. I dance badly but enthusiastically. I have fallen in love with a human who writes inappropriate things in his journal and teaches me puns that cause physical pain to those who hear them. I am everything Chancellor Vex says I am." She gestured, and holographic displays filled the chamber showing statistics that made even Vex's eyes widen. "Our military victories have increased by 400% because our soldiers actually enjoy fighting for a queen who knows their names and laughs at their jokes. Our economy has grown by 300% because happy workers are productive workers. Our diplomatic relations are the best they've been in centuries because other species actually like us now. We're not just feared, we're appreciated. Some species actually volunteer to join our empire because we seem fun." She turned to address the broadcast cameras, knowing trillions were watching across the empire. "For 300 years I was your perfect queen, emotionless, calculating, efficient. I conquered worlds and felt nothing. I ruled billions and knew none of them. I was a function, not a person. I was the eternal function that Vex wanted me to be." She pulled Daniel to stand beside her, ignoring protocol entirely. "Then this ridiculous human wrote that I have an architecturally perfect posterior, and I laughed for the first time in my existence. That laugh cracked something open in me, not weakness, but strength I didn't know I had. The strength to be vulnerable, the courage to be silly, the power to admit that sometimes the best response to the absurdity of existence is to laugh at it." She looked directly at Vex. "You say I've abandoned tradition. I say I've evolved it. You say I'm weak. I say I'm finally strong enough to show weakness. You say I'm corrupted. I say I'm completed. And if you cannot see the difference, then perhaps you're the one who needs to change." Daniel, realizing this was his moment, pulled out his journal, the same one that had started everything. "May I?" he asked the court. Before anyone could object, he began reading. Not just the embarrassing parts about the Queen's architecture, but everything else. How she worked 20-hour days to personally review every colonial dispute. How she'd secretly funded orphanages on 17 worlds, but insisted on anonymity. How she'd spent a week learning to make human coffee because she'd heard him mention missing it, even though the process involved chemistry that shouldn't work in their dimension. How she practiced jokes in the mirror, delighting in each successful punchline with the joy of a child discovering laughter. How she was the strongest person he'd ever met because she'd chosen to feel in a culture that saw emotion as weakness. "She hasn't become weak," Daniel concluded. "She's become complete. And if that threatens you, then you're not protecting the empire, you're protecting your own fear of change." The vote was called. It wasn't even close. The Queen kept her throne by a margin that suggested most of the empire had been desperately waiting for permission to smile for 3 centuries. As the crowd dispersed, many of them actually laughing and chatting instead of filing out in silent formation, Zyxara turned to Daniel. "You defended me," she said softly. "You laughed at my worst writing, seemed fair." "I have a confession," she said, pulling him close. "I've been writing in a journal too. Would you like to hear my entry about you?" "I'm terrified, but yes." Day 247. The human Daniel has structurally sound character, architecturally pleasing features, and his emotional framework is perfectly engineered. His butt, however, is merely adequately constructed. I choose to love him anyway. Daniel laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. "Merely adequate. I'm being generous, but your personality has excellent load-bearing capacity." Did you just use engineering metaphors to describe your feelings? You started it with your architectural assessment. It's only fair I return the favor." He kissed her then, not caring that the entire Zarathi Council was watching, that this was probably being broadcast across 17 systems, or that he'd started an emotional revolution with an inappropriate journal entry about an alien queen's perfect posterior. When they parted, Zyxara was smiling in that way that still looked slightly unpracticed but entirely genuine. "Marry me," she said suddenly. Daniel choked. "What?" "Marry me, be my official consort. Help me teach this empire that joy and power aren't mutually exclusive. Also, I've written 12 pages about your various architectural features, and I'd like to conduct more thorough research." "You're proposing to me in front of your entire council after a trial about whether you're too emotional." "Yes, it's called doubling down. I learned it from your poker explanations in entry 43. Daniel laughed, pulled her close, and said yes. The wedding was the first Zarathi ceremony where laughter was not just permitted but mandatory. The vows included promises to always provide honest architectural assessments and maintain structural integrity even when making terrible puns. Ambassador Harrison, who'd aged 10 years since the journal incident, served as efficient while muttering about how this was not what he'd signed up for when he joined the diplomatic corps. Years later, when historians tried to document how the Zarathi Empire transformed from an emotionless conquering force to the galaxy's most joyful civilization, they all had to start with the same embarrassing fact. It began with one human corporal's inability to keep his thoughts about an alien queen's perfect butt to himself. And in his journal that night, Daniel wrote, "Day 3847, still architecturally perfect. She still laughs when I tell her. Her jokes have improved marginally. Her puns remain weapons of mass destruction,